Loose and splashy live games are the most profitable poker games possible if you know how to adjust your strategy. But they can also be the most frustrating ones if you don't. And most players don't know how to beat these games. They tend to make exactly the wrong type of adjustments. It took me a while as well to figure out how to print money in these games, but in this video I'm going to show you what the right adjustments are, both pre-flop and post-flop, what mistakes you have to avoid, and what hands you should play in order to maximize your winnings. But why should you even listen to a random unshaved man with a bad haircut? Well, it's not that bad. Well, I've played live low-stakes poker for about a decade. Initially just recreationally and later professionally. And my win rate is about 10 big blinds per hour in live poker. Now I'm even a poker coach. And I've learned to make a living by finding these loose, splashy games and beating them. So join me on this deep dive in which you will learn everything you need to know in order to consistently win money in these games. So how do you even know that you're in a splashy loose game? Well, online poker pro Simon Draper, also known as Poker Elmo, went to play in a live 1-3 game not too long ago, and he posted some updates on his Instagram stories. And one of the updates read, "We're going 6 ways to every flop." So that's a pretty good sign that that's a quite loose and splashy game. Or look at this comment on Reddit. Someone said, "My regular game has about 10 to 15 regulars who play every day and are total and complete degenerates." Here's just an example. Player A, middle-aged divorcee, who buys in for $100, limp calls every hand and either goes broke or doubles up in the first 30 minutes. And player B, older, total degenerate, who plays every hand, gets all in with nothing. I've literally never seen him walk away a winner. Well, this does sound like a pretty good game. Other telltale signs for a loose and splashy games are excessive limping. So like if you see 2 or 3 or even more players limp all the time, pretty much in every hand, and you see them limp hands like King 6 offsuit or so, that is a great sign that you're in such a game. Another one is large opening sizes. Now, you can make money with large opening sizes, and we're going to talk about that later in this video. But in general, if you see someone open to 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 big blinds, which at 1-2, for example, a $15 or $20 open is not that uncommon, that's also a sign that this is going to be quite loose and splashy. And players rarely fold pairs is the next one. So by that I don't mean like to super big aggression, although even that can happen. But if someone has a second pair and they just call a triple barrel, so you go c-bet on the flop, bet on the turn, bet on the river, and they just call with second pair because, well, they have a pair so they can't fold, right? Also, very good sign that you're in such a game. Most players chase draws independently of the odds they're getting. So if you see someone with a gut shot in there and you overbet the flop and they call out of position with that gut shot, that's a great sign. But it doesn't have to be quite that extreme, even a flush draw or maybe even a combo draw or so, but where they just shouldn't call because they don't get the right odds and they don't really have the implied odds either, but they still call. They just chase every draw. Even if you go all in on the turn, they will still call with their open ender because they just can't fold because they have a draw, right? Also, very good sign. The next one is a willingness to commit a lot of money into the pot with marginal hands. So basically quite similar to the previous one, like second pair, third pair, something like that, top pair, weak kicker, and they're just willing to go all in, but not necessarily only to call, but some players, if they have, for example, a hand like Queen 10 on a board that's 10, 9, 5, deuce, 5 or something like that, they will just bet because they have top pair and they just disregard anything else and they just bet because they think they have a good hand. So another sign that you're in a loose and splashy game. So these all these factors sound like games that are quite typical in Texas or Florida, but they can happen everywhere, even in my London games that are usually much nittier than what I've just explained. But even here we do get these games sometimes, and you can just get them everywhere, pretty much wherever there are low stakes players. So if you're in such a game, congratulations! So we're going to talk about our strategy very soon, but before that, we have to want to consider what these players actually do wrong. And there are 2 or 3 things. So the main one is they play way too many hands. Obviously, if you just limp pretty much your entire range, you're playing way too many hands. But even if not, even if you don't have a limping range, but these players play like maybe 40 to 50% of their range. So there will be hands in there like ace-8 offsuit from under the gun. They will call with king-9 offsuit in the small blind to an early position raise, things like that. And then, as I said, all the limping that's going on, the limping, the over limping, or then they limp their 7-5 suited, they get isolated, and then they still call even though they're out of position and it was a big raise. They just play way too many hands and they invest way too much money pre-flop, and even if they hit the flop, they will never really recover the money long term. The second way is they play too passively. So it's not only that they have a hand like ace-8 offsuit and they will just really be aggressive with it. No, quite the opposite. They will limp it in early position, as I just said, and then call a raise with that, out of position even. So they are way too passive, but usually this passiveness, let's call it being passive. They do this pre-flop mainly, and they do it post-flop as well, but only if they don't really have a great hand. Because, and this is the other mistake they make, once they actually have a really big hand, then they will telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing and with them being very aggressive. So for example, if someone picks up pocket kings pre-flop, they might make it 10x there, so they will raise to 10 big blinds. If with every hand before that, they will just make it 5x. So with a hand like ace-9 offsuit, they'll make it 5x, and then with pocket kings, they make it 10x. That's one way. Or they limp something like pocket deuces pre-flop, then they hit a set on the flop, and then they will check raise, and then they will bet the turn really big, and if you don't fold by then they will go all in on the river or something like that. So these players are actually quite easy to play against, but we'll talk about that later as well. But these are the main mistakes. So they play way too many hands, they play them too passively, especially pre-flop, and they become really aggressive and bet very big once they have a big hand. Now that we know what these players do wrong, let's just try to think about our own strategy, and let's start with the pre-flop raise size. And that's quite a controversial topic. I've had lots of discussions about it because a lot of GTO players say you should always use the GTO sizes, and a lot of good live players say no, you have to go big and get more value in there. And both sides are right in some ways, but let's just look at these specific cases here with the loose and splashy players, because what I would suggest here is whenever you're in early position, you try to open quite small. Because the thing is, whether you have a big hand or a speculative hand or whatever, you do not want to invest a lot of money pre-flop. And this is the mistake I made a lot. I just kept the raise size the same just to make it easy. But no, I would definitely try to go smaller in early position. And I don't mean to have different raise sizes depending on your hand strength, because that again would be a mistake most of the time. But what I mean is, if you are in early position under the gun +1, something like that, don't make it much more than 3 big blinds. Now it depends. If you play 2-5, then I would always go 15 there, or possibly you can even go 12. And if you play 1-2 or 1-3, so again, on 1-3, I would probably go 10, but ideally you'd want to go a little smaller. And the mistake I made at 1-2 was that I always went to 10, but this really is wrong. You should go more like 6 there and not much more. 7 you can get away with if you have an edge there. The smaller your edge is, the lower I would go with the raise size in early position. Because think about it, let's say you have a speculative hand, you raise, and speculative hand, I mean, not really speculative, but something like ace-5 suited. So you raise there, and then you get like 3 or 4 callers, you're out of position, and even if you hit an ace on that flop, you don't really know how good you are, so you don't want to pile in a lot of money pre-flop there. And if you have a hand like pocket kings, yes, ideally you'd want to go heads up to the flop, but the problem is you can't control that. If you have 7 players acting behind you, well, you might get 7 calls, or you might get 1 or 2 or whatever. And it would be, I mean, from a technical perspective, if you have pocket aces or pocket kings, you can, in theory, make it 10x there. You're not making a mistake, but it's very difficult to then play anything else, because already with queens and jacks, it might not be the perfect raise size. And then with everything else, you shouldn't raise at all, basically, to this side. And not that I think that you have to be balanced, but I mean, even the biggest idiot will figure out after a while that if you raise that big from early position and you fold everything else, then they know that you have a big hand. So that's why from early position, always raise quite small. And then the later you get, and we're still talking about raise first in, so I know in these loose and splasher games this doesn't happen very often, but it happens sometimes that you're in the cutoff, for example, and everyone's folded to you. Here you can open a bit bigger, because it's likely that you will be in position, although I know in the cutoff you still have the button to worry about. But against the blinds, or especially if you are on the button, then you can raise big. Also, I would not recommend opening very wide on the button, but we'll get into that later as well. But try to raise a little bit bigger on the button than before. But bigger, what do I mean by that? Still not massive, so I would still only go to maximum 5 big blinds in most games. Now, there are exceptions. For example, if you are on the button and you know that both blinds are really terrible players, then you might as well go bigger. If you know that they will call there with a hand like Jack-8 offsuit and you have Ace-Queen, then by all means raise to 7 or 8 or even 10 big blinds if you know that they will call you out of position with a much weaker range than your hand is. But then don't make the mistake and do the same thing if you have a hand like Jack-8, even if you're in position. That just isn't a great hand to put a lot of money in pre-flop. And also, if you don't have good players behind you, then you can go bigger in general. So I always try to look out for the players who can exploit me, because the thing is, in GTO terms, you would never open to more than 2.5 big blinds. So in a 1-2 game, that's a raise to 5, which I realize in live poker, nobody usually does that. But if you have good players behind you, they can exploit you. They can 3-bet you. And this is, for example, what I try to do with other players who I see that they make this mistake. So then I 3-bet them relentlessly, and good players can do that to me or to you as well. That's why you have to be careful with good players behind you. If you have good players in front of you and they folded, you can basically pretend that they're not there. So yes, they might realize what you're doing if you raise bigger than normal, but they don't, but you shouldn't really care about that because they're not in the hand and they can't exploit you there. But if they are behind you, then you have to be more careful with that. And now let's just talk how to react against limpers. So that's also an interesting topic because, as we said, there will be a lot of limpers. And against limpers, if we assume that they're not tricky limpers. Now, there are quite a few players these days who will limp raise. But we're not talking about these. We're talking about these players who genuinely limp their ace-deuce offsuit because, well, they have an ace, right? So they want to see a cheap flop. So they will flick in the one big blind there. And then if you're in position especially, you can bet pretty big, and you've probably heard the expression punish the limpers, but it's not about punishing them really. So you don't want to do that yourself with a hand like ace deuce offsuit. You want to do it with a fairly strong range and fairly tight range, but you can go bigger there. Again, the caveat being the players behind you. So what you don't want to happen is if you play 1-2, someone limps, or say two players limp, and then you have a hand like a7 suited, you now go to 15, which I think is fine, you can do that. But if you have a good player or a couple of good players behind you who then might 3-bet you there, then you have to fold your hand. So you have to be very cautious with that as well. But in general, you can definitely go bigger here, because if you get called, you can assume that you're ahead of the range, you're then also in position, you have the skill edge, so you have lots of good things going for you. So I would definitely suggest you go on the bigger side against limps. Now let's move to actual raising ranges. So I know we don't want to think too much about our own range in terms of our opponents, because they won't care. But of course we have to know what kind of hands we want to open in what positions. So we're still talking about raise first in, and I have to say you have to play tight. Don't fall into the trap of doing what everyone else does at the poker table, at these live games. Just play your own game, and that means play tight. Now, what exactly does playing tight mean? Well, this is really easy. You can check the GTO ranges. And I know you don't want to play GTO in these low stakes live games. I'm totally on board with that. However, pre-flop, we do kind of have to not necessarily play full GTO ranges, but we have to use them as an orientation, and every good player does that. Now, if you're an absolute crusher, you can get away with deviating from these and playing looser. But if you're watching this video, chances are that you're not Phil Ivey or someone on that level. And I too opt to have a rather tight raising range, because I don't want to get caught out. Also, variance goes through the roof the looser you play, and it really isn't helpful, especially in such a high rake environment as live low stakes games tend to be. So what I would recommend is, for example, it doesn't have to be GTO Wizard, but GTO Wizard is my favorite one. And there, what you can do, just go there. You don't even need to pay for it. Just sign up, ideally with a link in the description below. And then you also get 10% off your first purchase there. But you can just go and check out their pre-flop ranges. So just go and have a look at the low jack position, for example. So you have 6 max, you have 9 max, and then they also have a live cash games one for 8 max, but that one is behind a paywall, so you do have to pay for that one. But you can use the other ones, just use the 6 or 9 max ones and just see what hands they open, and you kind of have to memorize them by heart. If you don't know how to memorize ranges by heart, I have a really easy shortcut for you in a video that I will leave in the description below, the link for that is. But you have to roughly know that, and as I say, you don't have to know the exact hands, but you should know roughly what hands to raise and what hand to fold there, and I would not deviate significantly from those ranges. And also the other thing is that we'll be playing multi-way pots a lot more than heads-up pots, and that is the reason why you should, if you deviate, you should deviate towards hands that play better multi-way. That's not necessarily the case, as I said, if you're on the button and everyone folds to you, because then it's likely that it will go heads up. But if you're in early position, for example, I would possibly go even a little tighter on these offsuit hands. So what hands do we want to avoid? There are hands like King Jack offsuit or Ace 10 offsuit in early position. And just to ask yourself, how often do you fold Ace 10 offsuit under the gun in a full ring live game? It's probably not very often, right? I mean, I tend to overplay these hands as well, because I know we get bored and we haven't had a hand in a while, and now we have an ace with a decent kicker and we try to play it. But that is a mistake, because Not necessarily, but even that can happen. Someone, if there are 7 players to act behind you, it's not unlikely that someone will have a better hand than you, or someone will make a move, and then once they 3-bet you, you have to fold. But the more likely scenario is that you will go, say, 4 or 5 ways to a flop, and this is just not a great spot to be in, out of position against 4 or 5 opponents with a hand like ace-10 offsuit. Even if you hit the ace, someone might be in there with jack-6 suited, and the flop comes ace-jack-6, and then it'll be very difficult to navigate. Also, someone might call with ace-jack, or I see players call there with ace-king even. So that's why best to avoid these situations. And yes, you will play even tighter and you will play fewer hands, but your win rate will thank you. Okay, and the other thing is open more with hands that can make the nuts in multi-way pots. And this is another deviation to the GTO ranges. If you look at them, for example, from early position, they say don't open small pocket pairs. However, I would always open small pocket pairs in such a game. It's unlikely that you will get 3-bet, and if you do, then, well, you have to see what the situation is. Then you might be able to set mine again. But the thing is, if you now go 5 ways to a flop and you're in early position with pocket deuces and the flop comes ace jack deuce this time, well, now you can really go crazy. You can either check raise there, or you can bet big already on the flop, and it's quite likely that one of the players will have an ace, and if they can't fold that, as we said earlier, a lot of these players will then get stacked, to put the entire stack in if they have an ace, especially with a decent kicker. And against these players, it's definitely advisable to play with pocket deuces. I'd much rather have open pocket deuces in early position in such a game than a hand like ace-10 offsuit. And the other hand class that I would always open are suited aces. So any suited ace can make the nuts, obviously, because you can have the nut flush. You can overflush someone who loves their suited connectors like 9-8 or something like that. So that is a very powerful hand, but you have to be careful, because if you open ace deuce suited and the flop comes ace jack 6, then you have to be very careful, because it's quite likely that someone's got you beat if you're 5 ways to such a flop. And now I would like to talk about stealing blinds, because in general poker is a game that revolves around stealing the blinds, because if there weren't any blinds, there wouldn't really be a game. However, in these splashy, loose, low stakes games, stealing the blinds does not matter at all, and that's for 2 reasons. First of all, you can't steal them most of the time, because there will be some sort of callers. Even if you're on the button or a small blind, you raise, someone will call you there. But even if it wasn't the case, there is a second reason which I think is even more important, and that is that blind stealing doesn't matter. Like if you play a 1-2, why risk money there to maybe eke out a tiny profit? If you have a hand like 10-8 offsuit, you raise on the button, which with that hand you shouldn't raise too big anyway, and even if you have a weaker player there, if he calls, yes, you might be able to c-bet and take the pot down on the flop, but the money you make there is just so little that it doesn't really matter. The way you make money here is by getting paid for your big hands and not by stealing a big blind here or a small blind there. So really just try to forget that, because a lot of players get very protective about their blinds, and they think they level themselves into even calling a 3-bet with a terrible hand if they try to steal the blinds, because they're thinking that the big blind might make a move on them or something like that. Just forget these things. Blinds really don't matter at these stakes at all. Just forfeit them. If you don't have a hand that you want to raise for value there, don't do it. The one exception maybe, and this has nothing to do with the blinds as such, but the one exception is if the big blind really is absolutely terrible and you know they will make massive mistakes post-flop, then you might want to go a bit wider on the button if it folds to you, or even a cut-off, because you want to play pots in position against that terrible player. But that is an exception, and even that you have to be very careful with it, because if you're not very good post-flop yourself, you might actually get yourself into big trouble there. But this, I can say, is the only time where I would say you can go a little bit wider with your openings on the button or in the cutoff. We've talked a lot about raising first in, but what's actually going to happen much more often is that someone in front of you will already raise in such a game. And so now we're going to talk about how to react to those raises. And this is where the majority of even decent and good live players will go wrong. And I did it wrong for many years, I have to admit at this point. But now I know what to do, and it is very different to what everyone else does. So in pretty much every position except for the big blind and potentially button, but I would even exclude the button. So let's say the only exception is the big blind. You want to play a 3-bet or fold strategy. Yes, that is correct. No calling from any other position. So if someone raises under the gun and there is a caller and you are in, say, the cutoff and you have a hand like pocket fives, don't call. Now, there is an exception just here now. If you have very passive players behind you and you think that you can see a flop with your pocket fives in that spot and the raise size wasn't huge, then it's okay to call there. But in general, this is not a spot where I would overcall. And if you overcall, then really only with a hand like this, like small to medium pocket pair. Definitely not with any offsuit hands, and even a hand like king jack suited or something like that. I would just always 3-bet such a hand, unless we are up against an absolute nit who hasn't raised in 4 hours and now he makes it 5x or something like that from under the gun. Then I would just fold my king jack suited, but I would definitely not call king jack suited in that scenario against anyone. And that's very, very important. And the one thing that's important to know is that every hand plays better heads up than multi-way. Yes, even pocket deuces and ace deuce suited or something like that, they prefer to play heads up, especially in position. So that's why you want to have a 3-bet or fold strategy for most positions. It's different in the big blind because you're getting a slightly better price, although I do realize that if it's a 1-2 game and the raise was to $10, then you still have to call $8 there. But the big advantage there is that you're last to act. Because if you call in the cutoff, there are still 3 players behind you who could 3-bet there. Even if they only do it with big value hands, someone could have ace king out of the 3 players, and then you just have to fold there. But in the big blind, this can't happen to you, and this is why in the big blind I would always call with decent playable hands. But in every other position, just try to see how that is. So as I said, the exceptions to this are if you have passive players behind you and you have a hand that can make the nuts, then you can call, but still I wouldn't do it from fairly early. So say under the gun opens, you're under the gun +1 with pocket fours, I would still just fold in that spot there, even if you have passive players behind you, because someone might just have a hand or someone might just decide to make a move there or whatever. So I would, in that case, just fold, and it is not a mistake to fold pocket fours there. The other exception is if you're on the button and you have really weak players in the blinds, then you can maybe get away with calling a little wider with hands that can make the nuts once again, because you want to play pots against those players behind you. But again, be careful. Like if there was a raise, a call, and then you call, and then you want the small blind and the big blind to call as well, you go 5 ways to a flop. So don't overcall a hand like ace-10 offsuit there, and even king-jack suited might not be the type of hand you want to overcall. So again, it's more like pocket pairs and suited aces. The other thing is, when you 3-bet, you have to do it a little bit differently from GTO, because what GTO does is GTO will raise a 3-bet a linear range in the small blind, and they will raise polar ranges in the other positions. Now, what's linear, what's polar? So linear means you just take the best few hands. So usually if you look at the grid, it's on the top left, the hands there, like aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace king, ace queen, and so on. So you just work your way down from there. That would be a linear range. If it's a polar range, then you would still have some of these best hands like aces, kings, queens, ace king, but then you would have a few bluffs in there as well. And bluffs can be something like 5-6 suited, they can be ace-5 suited, they can be king-7 suited or something like that. And in these loose and splashy games, I would suggest to only do linear 3-betting pretty much everywhere, because what you will achieve with that is that you will get called by a weaker range. Because the problem is these players tend to call 3-bets too wide. So a hand like ace-9 offsuit, for example, should never call a 3-bet out of position. But you will see players who do just that. And the problem with that is that if you have a hand like, say, jack-9 suited and they have ace-9 offsuit, well, now you are dominated. And even if you have jack-10 suited, you're still actually behind. So you might still be able to win the pot, and your equity is decent, and you have a suited hand and a playable hand and so on, but it's not ideal. But if you have ace jack in that spot and they call you with ace-9, now you dominate them. So that's why linear 3-betting is very important. However, the risk that you run here now is that you only really bet with your 3-bet with your very best hand, and you have to avoid that. So just go a little bit bigger than that. By bigger I mean, sorry, a bit wider. Something like ace-jack offsuit in position can be a good one. Even ace-10 offsuit can be a good hand to 3-bet there, or as I said, pocket pairs. And yes, if you 3-bet pocket 5s and they call you with ace-9 offsuit, they still have about 45% equity there. However, if you are in position and then they just whiff the flop, you can c-bet and take it down. Plus, if you hit a set there, might even stack them if an ace comes or something like that. But in general, as I said, just 3-bet linearly. And the third thing is, and I can't stress this one enough, this is so important, be price sensitive. What that means is that the bigger their open raising size is, the less you should call. So in general, you want to fold more, but also you want to shift some of your calls into 3-bets. So for example, if someone raises, and we're not really talking about the positions, this is only just to understand the theory. If someone opens to 2 big blinds, you can just call much wider. So for example, if you are in the big blind and someone in position raises, you just get to call a very wide range. If they open to 3x, this range already gets reduced. And if they raise to 4x, then you have to be much more careful. So look at this grid, for example. This is a big blind calling range against the 4x raise. And as you can see, you barely call any hand. You play mostly a fold or raise strategy, and it's basically mostly a fold strategy. And this is when they raise to 4 big blinds. So now imagine the raise to 5 or 7 or 8 big blinds or even 10 big blinds. And I see so many players call with pocket 5s to a 5 big blind raise against someone. Let's say if they're really bad, okay, maybe you can get all their money post flop. But the thing is, like, against a competent player, you should just never even consider calling. And yes, it's absolutely okay to fold pocket 5s there, because what happens is when he risks so much money to raise there and you have a really good hand, now you are making all that money back. And that's why it's absolutely okay to fold pocket 5s, 6s, 4s, whatever, to a raise that's so big. But that is not only valid for the big blind, that's valid everywhere. Just the bigger the raise is, the more price sensitive you have to be. And it's exactly like doing your weekly shop. Like you just wouldn't go and buy sparkling water for $25. You would have to see what the price is and then act accordingly. And you have to do exactly the same thing when you're at the poker table. And I see way too many players be way too loose against these really big bet sizes. The next really big mistake that a lot of live poker players make is when they are in multi-way pots, they play way too wide ranges once again. And this is the secret sauce here. In multi-way pots, you have to defend tighter, not looser. Don't flick in that call with 9-7 suited, with 10-9 offsuit, with Queen 10 offsuit, and so on. And I'm not even talking about big raises. That was the mistake we talked about earlier when they raised to 5x. Even if you're in the big blind and there is basically just a min raise, which doesn't even happen in live poker, but if that happens and then there are 3 or 4 callers there, you have to fold. And I can see a lot of you now thinking, no, I would never fold 9-7 suited. This is such a great hand. We could make a flush, we could make a straight, whatever. Yes, in theory you could, but with a flush you have to be very careful because you can get over flushed there. And with a straight, I mean, how likely is it that you will have the nut straight? And if you don't have the nut straight, then it might be even worse. So for example, if someone has Jack 9 and the flop come, or the straight would be with a 10, 8, 6, is it right? Yeah, I think so. And then you have a straight, someone else has a straight. You just get stacked in both these situations. Plus, it's very difficult to realize all your equity, because that is the main thing in multi-way pots. And this is very, very important to understand. The equity of all hands combined in multi-way pots and in hands-up pots is always just 100%. It doesn't go up. So a hand like aces, for example, if your aces against pocket deuces, that's 81% equity for aces, 19% for deuces. But now just put in there 4 or 5 more random hands, and now the equity is still 100% if you combine all of these equities. So now pocket aces are not a favorite anymore to win. They're still a bigger favorite than any other of the hands to win the pot. However, the equity is still only like 40-45%, something like that. So you are actually an underdog to win a hand with pocket aces if you're up against 4 or more opponents. And this is very important to consider. And so many players make this mistake because they just think, oh, it's hardly anything that I have to call there. And I see so many players, they think like, oh, I have to call. I'm in the small blind, everyone limped. I have to put that $1 or $2 in there now because I'm committed to this one. I'm priced in. That's usually the word people use there. But no, they're not priced in. That's absolutely silly. What they are doing is actually they're losing money. Admittedly, it's not a lot of money because yes, they only have to put in $1 there, but basically they're only getting back, I don't know, I'm plucking this out of thin air, but something like 80 cents on that dollar. So they're losing 20 cents if they flick in the call there. So why would you want to do that if you know that long term this is losing? Yes, you would want to do it just to play bingo, basically, to just hope to hit something there, to hit something big, but the likelihood of that happening is small, and it's more likely that you will lose more money post flop. Because let's say you have 9-7 suited there and the flop comes Jack 9 deuce, someone bets and you think, well, I now have to call once or something like that, although even that would already be a mistake in a multi-way pot, but that's how players lose even more there. So just really be much tighter. So same consideration as with bigger raise sizes, reacting to those, you have to do the same adjustment in multi-way pots and just be much tighter and only play hands that play really well multi-way. And now to the big question, should we ever limp? And I would say absolutely never open limp in these games. So if you have a hand like pocket deuces in early position, you just decide whether you want to raise it or fold it. As I said earlier, I would raise such a hand, but don't limp, because someone might then raise really big and then you'll have to lose or give up the money that you've invested, or you have to throw good money after the bad and call and then probably whiff the flop and lose even more money. So that's why never open limp. It's different if someone has limped ahead of you, especially if there's a limp and another limp, and then you're somewhere in the hijack or cutoff. If you don't expect the players behind you to be very aggressive, you can limp behind there, but again, only with hands that make sense. So just good multi-way hands like small to medium pocket pairs and suited aces, and no suited connectors are not good multi-way hands. Once again, you can get over flush, you can get over straighted. That's just really not a great idea to do that, and that's why just really play tight. Once again, sorry if I sound like a broken record, but this is how you beat these games. Just play tight. If I had to summarize it, this would be the title of the summary. So just play tight and don't get in there with too much junk. And also beware the rake, or the drop as it is called in some places. For example, in California, I would absolutely never limp behind. In their typical games there where they take a drop, so I know that there is this one game where they take, I think, what is it, $7 in a 1-2 or 1-3 game. They take $7 as soon as they lay the flop. Now imagine there are two limps, and then you limp behind, and maybe small blind completes and big blind checks their option. So now there are $10 in the pot, but they take $7 out of the pot. So you now called $2 to then win $1 extra, $1 that's in there. So I would just absolutely never do that in such a game. If you play in a game like where I play, where the rake is 5% kept at 10, that's a different story, because then if there's $10 in the pot, they only take 50, well, it's not dollars, it's pounds because I play in England, but anyway, they take 50 pence out of it, so there's still £9.50 in the pot. So in that case, it's not that bad. But yeah, in games where there is a drop, basically that's what we can say. If there is a drop as soon as the flop gets laid, I would absolutely say never ever limp in those games. And also, speaking of never limping, absolutely never limp premium hands like aces or kings or even queens or something like that. I see so many players do that, and then they will feel vindicated because they won a small pot or something like that. But that's just absolutely silly. You will often lose a bigger pot because these players tend to not be able to let go of their big hand once the flop is there or the turn, and then they might get stacked by a set or two pair or something like that. But the main thing is you want to put a lot of money in with your best hand. So you do not want to limp, especially in such a game where then everyone else might limp behind and you go 6 ways to the flop. Congratulations, in a limp pot with pocket aces or something like that. So absolutely never limp your premium hands. So what about people who say you have to get in there to battle, to see a lot of flops? Like for example here in this one, there's again this Reddit comment where the guy asked earlier how to play. There was a comment there saying you need to see as many cheap flops as you can. So yeah, in theory that is a great idea, but it has to be with a good hand and ideally in a good position. So what you don't want to do is exactly what I said earlier. You don't want to be in there with hands that can be dominated or that just play poorly multi-way. You do want to see cheap flops with good hands. I totally agree with that. But these good hands, as I said, have to be small pocket pairs and suited aces. So now hopefully you know how to play pre-flop in these games, because I think this is where most players make their biggest mistakes. So once you know how to do that, then you can move on to post-flop, and this is what we're doing now. And this section again is mainly about multi-way play, because as we said, we're probably not going to play too many heads up pots unless we play 3-bet pots, but in general we want to stick to the multi-way pots because this is very important. And I have a few things here to mention, and the first one is forget being balanced, and I think many of you might not consider this anyway in live poker, but if you are someone who plays a lot of online poker or against just poker against better opponents, then obviously you need to be more aware of being balanced. Here I would not care about that. If you have a big hand, just go for it, and if not, then don't. So just forget that. Just really fast play your big hands and get out of the way if you don't have anything, or if you have marginal hands, just try to get further into the hand without paying a lot for that. The second one thing is, and that's also very important, you have to bluff less. The thing is that especially in these games, people don't like to fold. Now, I know there are a lot of small stakes players who do fold too much, they overfold, but the games I'm talking about now, this is usually not the case, because these players, as we established earlier, they like to call you down with second pair or pocket pair that didn't connect with the flop, or chase draws with ace high, and then they might win the pot against your queen high bluff or something like that. So that's why just be very careful with bluffing. And if you bluff, you really have to be very convincing. And that means you have to bluff aggressively and big, and you have to just know to be smart what to use. But I would say if you really truly play a game like this one, don't bluff at all, basically. Don't try even with good draws. So maybe if you have a combo draw that you would like to get in on the flop or so, you can do that. But other than that, in multi-way pots, just play them rather passively. And yes, check raising a very good draw can be fine, but again, if your opponents just don't fold, then I don't really see much scope in betting too much and bluffing too much. So just be very careful with bluffing. Third thing is just the other way. You have to fold bluff catchers to big bets from passive players, and I say this in almost every one of my videos. Again, sorry if I sound like a broken record, but this is super important. If a player just limps every hand and then check calls the flop and check folds the turn, or check calls down to the river with second pair or something like that, and he now suddenly decides to pile the money in and can't get the money in there fast enough, then it is time for you to fold. So even if you have a decent bluff catcher and don't even think about blockers or anything like that, just fold in that spot. Yes, sometimes they will just make a move out of the blue and you will get annoyed to have folded the decent hand there. But if you can't beat their value, just fold if they bet big and they're normally quite passive. And then the opposite of that kind of is for you to bet thinly for value. And that is if you have top pair and mediocre kicker or something like that, and the action is being very passive, don't be scared to then bet third pot or something like that, even if you have 3 players behind you to act, because you can definitely get called by weaker hands. The only thing is don't go too thinly if it goes very multi-way. So for example, if you do, or if for some reason it starts out as a 5-way pot, and then by the end it's only 3 players left, then you only have to get through 2 players there with your thin value bet. Sorry, that's the wrong terminology. I don't mean getting through, but only 2 players can have better hand than you. So there you can, for example, even possibly bet second pair, which I do sometimes if no one has shown much strength. But if you are up against 4 players, then you don't necessarily want to bet second pair, because especially second pair, bad kicker, or third pair or something like that, because you might get called by a better hand, and in that case your hand is pretty much just junk. Before we get to what is probably the most important part of this video, I would like to just summarize the mistakes that you probably make, and that is you open too wide, you call way too much pre-flop, you're not aggressive enough either, you limp hands behind that you shouldn't, you call the big blind too wide, and you play too tricky rather than playing ABC. So that I see a lot of players and that do this. So for example, like limping pocket kings, or then just having a set or quads or something like that, and then just check calling the flop and check calling the turn and hoping that they bet the river or something like that. So just fast play there. So these 5 mistakes, if you can eliminate them, you will do very well. And now, as promised, let's go to what I think is the most important thing, because this is basically the main consideration here, and that is the mental game aspect of all of this. So what will happen is you will be playing for 3 hours, not having a hand, not hitting a single flop, and at the same time you see the guy next to you, how he has the nuts in every other hand, and he doesn't even know how to stack up his chips anymore because he has way too many of them. These sessions will happen, and they happen more than you will want them to happen. I kind of get the feeling that I have them all the time, but this is part of the game, and you have to realize that you are still making money. It is very, very frustrating to see a player who is really, really bad and he's just giving away money, and you just can't have any of this money. And even worse is when he just gives his money to everyone else at the table, and then you play one pot against him and he calls you with his jack deuce against your pocket aces, and then the flop comes jack 4 deuce or something like that, and he wins a big pot off you. This can be incredibly frustrating, and we've all been there. But the thing is, as I said, you have to remember that you are still making money with all of this. You make money by folding hands that your opponents don't fold. This is the so-called reciprocality theory that I explained in more detail in this video here.